Well, hey there and welcome in. If we haven't met, I'm Viv. This is Art with Viv and this is the Gouache Goodness Week. Now this month I decided to go back to the basics with all different kinds of mediums that I like to work in. We started off with pastel, then we did watercolor last week. This week is our Gouache Goodness, and next week we're going to do some journaling. Just some basics on journaling. This week we're doing basics on gouache. The reason I did this is because I have a lot of really beginners, like they really are green beginners in my Patreon. So I wanted them to have a little base of knowledge just to get them started so that they could have, they could build on that knowledge. So I'm going to give them the foundations and let them start building on the knowledge. And from here on out, then each week I could have different lessons, different tutorials, and they'll kind of know what I'm talking about because they'll have the basics down. So this week it's all about gouache goodness. So the first thing I'm going to go over is the types of gouache that you can get. The second thing I'm going to go over, types of paper, and then brushes. Just like watercolor, gouache is very similar to watercolor. It's its opaque cousin. All right, so let's just go to the studio and get started. So let's talk about the forms that gouache come in. But first, let me back up. Let me tell you a little bit about gouache. Gouache is watercolor's sort of opaque cousin. Now we're talking about traditional gouache. There's two kinds of gouaches. There's traditional gouache. It will reactivate with water. And then there's acrylic gouache, which is suspended in actual acrylic polymers, and it will not reactivate once it's dry. It's pretty much dry. It doesn't do well with reactivation. So if you want to paint paintings that you don't have to put under glass, then acrylic gouache is for you. But I don't paint with acrylic gouache. I only do use the traditional, so we'll get that out of the way. Gouache can be used much like watercolor in a lot of the ways. The main difference is, or the main differences, there's a few, between watercolor and gouache. Gouache is more opaque. It's going to go on, you can't see through it. Whereas watercolor is beautiful and translucent and gives that stained glass effect. Gouache, to mix tints and tones, you use white. You use white paint. Watercolor, you do not use white. You use the actual whiteness of the paper so that that white of the paper shines through, and that gives you your light. You do not mix watercolor, traditional watercolor, with white gouache. Now if you want your watercolor to act more like gouache, you can mix in some white gouache with it, and that'll make it more opaque. The other thing is, the last thing is, watercolor needs to be applied to white paper because of that, the fact that you use the white of the paper as the light in the paint instead of mixing it with white. Whereas gouache, you can paint gouache on colored paper, no problem. They both need to be on thicker paper that is, water resistant, it doesn't buckle. And so that's that. You can use watercolor paper for your gouache, or mixed media paper, any kind of paper that will stand up to water and won't buckle and is thick enough to hold the paint. So I just wanted to tell you what, a few of those little differences between watercolor and gouache. Now I'm going to go over the forms of gouache. Of course, you can get gouache in tubes, and tubes, they have more consistent control. You can easily adjust the amount of water to create, thick, opaque layers, or you can add water to get translucent layers. The color intensity is generally better with the tubes, and it has more versatile application. Now it can dry out on the palette. Of course you can reactivate it, so that's not as big of a con, but paint that has already dried out on the palette is not going to be as fresh and juicy as paint straight from the tube, but it still is fine. Storage, it requires more space to store because of the tubes are bigger, and you can waste it since you're going to squeeze it out onto a palette. You can end up wasting some of your paint if you don't come back to that palette, reactivate it, and use it for something else. Then there is cake or pan gouache. and this is a student grade one. I don't know the name of it. I know it was really inexpensive, but it does come in a variety of colors, but they are less vibrant. It's time consuming because you have to wet these and let them soak a little bit so that you can activate the paint so that you can actually paint with them. You have limited consistency and control, so these would probably be a lot more translucent. It's harder to make these as opaque as, say, from the tube. So that is just, you know, some of the pros and cons. It is less expensive. It's kind of bulky to travel with, but you can travel with it easily, more easily than the tubes, put it that way. Then you have a relatively new type of gouache, and that is Hemi gouache, which is a jelly gouache. This is my Hemi gouache. You can get these in different sets and sizes with different amounts of colors in there. These are 30 milliliter blocks. Well, not really blocks because they're liquid, but they come in 30 milliliters, which is quite a bit of paint. It's really jelly-like, so when you paint with it, sometimes it doesn't have a nice consistency, but it is ready to use. It's already wet. It pretty much stays wet as long as you keep that top container, the top to the container on, that airtight top, it will. It is very vibrant with the colors, easy storage, and it's just fun and novel, but I wouldn't use it for serious work that you plan on selling. Now, the cons, it is a little bit bulky because, you know, that's a lot of paint in there. It could dry out and crack. Then you would have to, if you did let it dry out and it would start to crack, you'd have to reconstitute it. And that might not be as nice to paint with, having to reconstitute it. It's very messy and it can be a challenge to work with. Like I said, when you paint with it, it has a really weird consistency. But it's still, I wanted to mention it, and I do have a set to show you, so there you go. That is jelly gouache. For this week, we're just going to use tube gouache, though. That's what I'm going to focus on. There's two grades of gouache, just like in watercolor. There's student grade, and there is professional grade. So let me show you. These are my two student grades. These up here, I think it's 24 colors, is Royal and Langnickel. They are very inexpensive. You can get this for like maybe $10, $12 for 24 colors. Very inexpensive. Winsor and Newton, this is my Winsor and Newton set, which you can get this set of, I think it's 10 colors for not very much money at all. I want to say it's like, is it $14? Anywhere between $10 and $14. I can't remember. I bought these over a year ago. But these are their student grade. And you get this set of 10. It's a little more expensive than the Royal and Langnickel. Of course, it's a little better quality. Then you got your professional gouaches, which this is the Winsor & Newton Professional. So the difference is, you know, this is Winsor & Newton gouache, but the professional says designer's gouache on it, and the tube looks a little different. And I also like this Holbein Artist's Gouache. This is what I use the most. I really love it. So we'll just go over just some of the differences between student grade and professional grade. And it's much like watercolor. The pigment quality and concentration. Student gouache, it has lower quality pigments, less pigment in there, more binders. The professional has higher quality pigment, more, you know, less binder, more pigment, so it's even more opaque. Student grade doesn't have as much of a color range as the professional grade, and these often have more single pigment options. You want a single pigment option if you can get it. Two pigments, you know, contained in one color is okay, but when you start getting more than that, it's not really a reliable or a good pigment, a good color to get. Light fastness, student grade tends to not be light fast, which means it'll fade over time. The same things as watercolor, so we're just going over some of the same basic things as watercolor. Artist grade, of course, will stand the test of time. It is generally light fast. It's best for archival work. price. Student grade tends to be much less expensive. Artist grade, much more expensive. Mixing and application, student grade is harder to control when you're mixing your colors. And it has a tendency to become muddy more easily because it doesn't have as much pigment load in there. The artist grade, it'll allow for smoother blending, more consistent drying, and greater control over transparency or opacity. So that is your gouache. Now I just wanted to show you some examples of gouache painting on different papers. It's best to use, like I said, water resistant paper or paper that resists buckling, like a good 140-pound watercolor paper. You can use mixed media paper. You can even put gouache on canvas, but I don't recommend it. So I'm going to just show you some examples. Now these are the Pantone little postcards that you can buy, and I am doing that challenge. I'm trying to paint my Pantone cards with my gouache. Let me tell you that this is how can you see the shininess? Yeah, the shininess of the Pantone card. Well, the gouache will not stick to that very well, so what I do is I just tape off the bottom so that I have my nice neat line here, and then I put some clear gesso. You got some clear gesso here, and I just do a layer of clear gesso over that, and that roughs it up and dulls it down, and the gouache will stick so much better and be permanent. So that is my trick there. Just use a little bit of clear gesso because the surface is shiny and slick and the paint will not stick to that well. So here are some examples that I have painted on my Pantone postcards. I got some roosters that I've been working on, a buffalo, you know about my ducks, my cute little ducks. And so that is on those Pantone postcards. And again, put you a little bit of clear. You want to put a little bit of clear gesso on that and let it dry. Now here is just regular watercolor paper in my sketchbook, and this is actually jelly gouache. Let me make it clear that this is professional. I used professional grade. This is my whole bean, so you can see the difference in the vibrancy between the jelly gouache and the whole bean colors. This is much more transparent, much brighter and vibrant. So here is a good example between student grade jelly gouache and artist grade whole bean gouache. So you can see the difference. Also, like I said, it's jelly gouache is just a little bit weird to work with. And here's another one I did with jelly gouache. Again, you can see the difference in the quality. But this is just regular sketchbook, but it is watercolor paper and it is pretty thick, like 140 pounds. So that's how jelly gouache looks on watercolor paper. This I used regular student grade wash. This is my student grade, the Royal and Lang nickel, just on paper. And this paper is kind of thick, but it's not as thick as watercolor paper or those postcards, but it can stand up to water. So I did this directly on this type of paper in my dot journal. The trick was I just used less water so that it wouldn't buckle and it wouldn't, wrinkle up. I did it all the way throughout the month. This is from last year. This is my last year's bullet journal. And I did gouache paintings on each weekly layout. And you see it came out really pretty. This is the student grade, so I used student grade in here on just plain paper. So it does do a good job. If you want to get the student grade, then by all means do, especially if you're not sure that you want to stick with gouache. It's very inexpensive, so that's what I would do. I would just start with the student grade and just get you like the 6 primaries like we talked about in watercolor, and maybe a few purples and a few greens with that. And that's what I would do. Now this I did gouache, and then I did some pen and ink dots, some stippling over it just to give it some definition. But yes, this is straight onto the actual paper. So you can use a variety of papers. You can also use toned paper with gouache. and it'll be just fine because it's opaque. Next, let's talk about brush. So any kind of brushes that are used for watercolor or acrylic that are soft can be used for gouache. You can use inexpensive brushes, you can use, more expensive watercolor brushes, you can use the same brushes that you use for your watercolor, but I do suggest washing them thoroughly in between with some warm water if you switch over. Now this right here was all done with these golden maple detail brushes, and these are for watercolor or acrylic or gouache. So you can get any kind of brushes as long as they have a nice soft bristle. I like the softer bristle, and a good point if you need a lot of detail work. But these are the brushes that I use mostly for my gouache. Again, I will link some, I'll link some suggestions for you, but these both were painted with these tiny detail brushes. So I just thought I would show you that. You can also need a palette to mix your gouache on. I have a tendency to use hold on, let me get it. I have a tendency to just use meat trays that I wash out, and that's it. You might want some kitchen roll for it. You're going to need 2 containers of water, just like watercolor, so that you can rinse your brush and use your other brush to get water to mix with. You can use anything for a palette. Remember that these can be reconstituted. Let me show you. These are all dry, but if you wet them, see, it's just like watercolor. It'll come right back to life. So you can save your palettes. You don't have to waste them. You can just, use your palettes, let them dry, and then if you want to do another painting using that same color scheme or whatever, then you have it ready. And I just keep these in a stack. So I just want you to be good to yourself, get yourself motivated, don't get stressed out. Art is to relax, don't get your panties in a wad, and I will see you Wednesday when we go over some basic techniques, and I want to show you watercolor versus gouache. See you then.